They say the cold in Harlan Valley doesn't just bite, it hunts. And on one fateful night, it nearly claimed two innocent souls. But why did their dying father send them to a man who had long abandoned hope? And what truth was buried beneath snow, silence, and fear? This is not just a story of the Wild West. It's a story of secrets, courage, and a fight against a system built on greed. Stay until the end, because nothing here is as simple as it seems. If you enjoyed this journey, take a moment to comment your thoughts, share with others, and subscribe for more stories that touch the heart.
It was December 14th, 1878. 11 at night. The cold in Harlan Valley didn't just bite, it hunted. The temperature had dropped to 20 below, maybe 30. The kind of cold that freezes your breath to your beard before you can even exhale. Elias Kane was out back, behind the faded red barn, splitting wood in the dark. He didn't need the wood. The stove was already full, but he needed the swing of the axe. He needed the ache in his shoulders. It was the only thing that kept him tired enough to sleep, kept the ghosts quiet. He brought the axe down, hard. Wood splintered, silence settled back in. Then he heard it. A sound. Not the wind howling through the valley, not a branch snapping under the weight of the snow. It was a rustle, a shift in the snowbank. Elias was a former marshal. He had 15 years of bad memories that taught his ears the difference between the weather and a person. He dropped the axe. He didn't reach for his gun. The Colt was in the house, sitting in a drawer he hadn't opened in a long time. He walked toward the western fence line, slow, careful, his boots crunching through the crust of the snow. He reached the old pine tree. The shadows were deep there. He squinted. Two shapes, small, tangled up in each other against the trunk. He dropped to his knees. The snow soaked right through his heavy denim, but he didn't feel it. Two girls. They couldn't have been more than 7 years old, identical. Auburn hair matted with ice. No coats, just layers of thin, worn-out cotton shirts pulled over each other. They had taken off their frozen shoes and stuffed their bare feet inside each other's shirts to keep from losing their toes. They were starving. You could see it in the hollows of their cheeks, the blue tint to their cracked lips. The edge of death was sitting right there on their shoulders. The smaller one, Nora, had her eyes closed, her chest barely moving. But the older one, Clara, her eyes were wide open, dark brown, staring right at Elias. She wasn't crying, she wasn't screaming. She just looked at him with the terrifying calm of a child who had accepted that the world wasn't built to save her. Her lips moved. It took her a second to find the breath to make a sound. Her voice was just a rasp against the wind. "Papa said go to the man with the red barn." She paused, swallowing hard. "He said that man would know what to do. Even if he doesn't know, he knows yet." Elias couldn't speak. The wind howled over them. For 4 years, Elias had convinced himself his heart was dead, burned to ash in a fire he couldn't put out. But looking at this little girl, something in his chest shifted, a heavy, painful beat. He didn't ask questions. You don't ask questions to ghosts in the snow. He stripped off his heavy leather coat. He wrapped it around both of them, bundling them tight against his chest. He stood up. He carried them inside. The house was dark. Elias kicked the door shut behind him. He laid them gently on the rug in front of the stone hearth. He threw logs onto the embers, bellowed the flames until they roared. He grabbed a heavy wool blanket, filled the kettle, poured a cup of hot water. His hands were moving with the swift, steady memory of a lawman. But his fingers shook, not from the cold. Nora was still unconscious, but her breathing was growing deeper. The heat was finding her lungs. Clara sat up. She clutched the tin cup of warm water with both hands. She didn't drink right away. She let the heat soak into her palms. She watched Elias, watched him feed the fire. After a long minute, she spoke. Her voice was stronger now, but it carried a weight no 7-year-old should ever have to hold. "Mr. Kane," she said. Elias stopped. He turned to look at her. "Eat the bread, Clara. Drink the water." She didn't take a bite. She just looked at the flames. The men in town, Mr. Dusk's men. They said orphans without a dime are as cheap as prairie weeds. They said we don't have a price tag, so Mr. Dusk can just take our land and sweep us away. Nobody would care. She looked up right into Elias's eyes. Do our lives have a price tag, Mr. Kane? Is that why nobody stopped them? Elias felt his jaw tighten. The anger, a righteous, violent anger he thought he'd lost, flared up hot in his blood. He walked over. He knelt down so he was right at eye level with her. Listen to me, Clara, Elias said. His voice was rough but steady. You listen close, and you don't ever forget it. Human life doesn't come with a price tag. I don't care what the bankers say. I don't care what the lawmen in town tell you. No man's blood is richer than another's. It doesn't matter if a man sleeps in a mansion with velvet curtains or if he freezes under a pine tree out back. He pointed a calloused finger at the fire, then back to her. A life is a life. Every single person on this earth has the exact same right to be safe, to be warm, and to keep breathing. Your life and your sister's life has the exact same value as the richest man in Wyoming. That is a basic, undeniable human right. It's a truth no amount of money can buy, and no corrupt system can strip away. You understand me? Tonight you stepped through my door, and in this house you have absolute worth. That is the only truth that matters. Clara stared at him. She absorbed the words. She chewed on them. Then, slowly, she nodded, like a judge issuing a final verdict. She took a small sip of the water. Then she looked over at her sister, still sleeping on the rug. Nora is scared of the dark, Clara whispered. Softly now, almost a secret. But she won't say so, she never says so. Could you leave one lamp on? Elias looked at the sleeping girl. He looked around his house. It had been dark for 4 years. A tomb. He stood up. He walked over to the table by the window. He struck a match. He touched it to the wick of the oil lamp. A soft golden glow pushed the shadows back into the corners of the room. He didn't turn it off. Elias walked back to the chair near the door. He sat down. He didn't sleep. He stayed awake, listening to the steady, rhythmic breathing of the twin girls. And for the first time since he came to Harlan Valley, Elias Kane didn't wish he was dead. Morning came slow to Harlan Valley. It didn't break. It just sort of bled through the gray clouds. Elias hadn't slept. He sat in the wooden chair by the door. Stiff. Quiet. The oil lamp had burned down to a sputter, but the fire in the hearth was still throwing heat. The girls were asleep on the rug, tangled together. A mess of auburn hair and borrowed wool blankets. They were breathing deep, steady. Elias stood up. His knees popped. He threw another log on the fire. He put on his heavy coat, the one still damp from the snow, and walked out the door. The cold hit him like a hammer. He pulled his collar up. He started walking east. Agnes Holloway lived a mile down the ridge. She was 63, a widow. She had survived the Civil War as a field nurse. She had survived 2 winters where the flour ran out in January. She didn't scare, and she didn't mince words. Elias knocked on her heavy oak door. It was barely past 6. The door swung open. Agnes stood there, fully dressed, coffee cup in hand. She took one look at Elias's face, the tight jaw, the tired eyes. "Who's bleeding?" she asked. "Nobody," Elias said. "I got 2 kids at my place." Agnes stopped. She took a sip of her coffee. "You got kids in your house?" "2 of them." "How old?" "7. Girls or boys?" "Girls, twins." Agnes set her cup down. She grabbed her heavy shawl and her bonnet. "What do you know about keeping a child alive, Elias Kane?" Elias didn't answer. He didn't have to. "Lord Almighty," she muttered, tying her bonnet tight. "Your place is probably cold as a fresh grave. You got flour? Eggs? Tell me what you got." They walked back in silence. The snow was knee-deep. They pushed through it. When they opened the door to Elias's cabin, the girls were awake. Clara was sitting straight up. Her hair was a bird's nest. She had the blanket pulled up to her chin. She watched Agnes walk in with the sharp, assessing eyes of a survivor. She was reading the room, reading the threat. Agnes didn't coddle. She didn't put on a fake, sweet voice. She just looked right back. "My name is Agnes," she said. She hung her shawl on a peg. "I'm the neighbor. I'm going to cook. And that man over there," she pointed a thumb at Elias, "is going to stand around looking like he doesn't know what to do with his hands. That's normal. Are you hungry?" Clara blinked. Then she relaxed. Just a fraction. "I'm Clara. My sister is Nora, and yes, ma'am, we are very hungry. We haven't eaten since Wednesday." It was Saturday morning. Agnes didn't gasp. She didn't clutch her pearls, but her jaw set so hard it could have cracked a walnut. She turned to the stove. She started rattling pans. Nora woke up a few minutes later. She rubbed her eyes. She smelled the bacon grease and the cornmeal. She stood up, the oversized shirt swallowing her tiny frame, and walked over to the stove. She just stood there, watching Agnes with absolute fascination. "You want to help, little one?" Agnes asked, not looking down. Nora thought about it. "I never cooked cornmeal. Papa always said I'd burn it." "Was your papa right?" "Once," Nora admitted. "But that was because Clara was distracting me." "I was just asking why corn was yellow," Clara piped up from the rug. It was a normal question. Agnes chuckled, a low, gravelly sound. Elias stood in the corner. He watched them. And for a second, the cabin didn't feel so empty. But then Agnes plated the food. She set it on the wooden table. The girls sat down. They didn't eat right away. They stared at the food, like it was a trick, like it might disappear. Agnes watched them eat, and the humor drained right out of her face. She looked at Elias. She walked over to him, keeping her voice low, but the fury in it was hot enough to boil water. "You look at this, Elias," Agnes said. Her voice trembled just slightly with raw anger. "You look at what this system does to the vulnerable. The men in town, the bankers, the lawyers, that bastard Harlan Dusk. They sit in their warm offices while children freeze in the snow." Elias looked at the floor. "It's the way the territory works, Agnes." "Then the territory is broken," she snapped. She pointed a finger toward the girls. "The law is supposed to be a shield for orphans like these. It's not supposed to be a butcher's knife for tycoons to carve up their land. Children have a right to live. They have a right to be fed, and they have a right to be safe. That is a basic human right. It is a fundamental decency that not even God gives a man permission to strip away. And any man who stands by and lets it happen is just as guilty as the man holding the knife." Elias felt the words hit him, square in the chest. He knew she was right. After breakfast, Agnes took Nora to the wash basin to scrub her face. Clara stayed at the table. She traced the grain of the wood with her finger. Elias sat across from her. "You want to tell me what happened, Clara?" Clara kept tracing the wood. "Papa went to town to sell some timber. He didn't come back. The next day, a man came to the house." "What man?" "He had a badge," Clara said. She looked up. Her eyes were dark, serious. "A silver star. But he wasn't a good man. He wore a black leather coat. He had a little scar right here." She pointed under her left eye. "He said Papa had an accident. He said we had to come with him. We locked the door. He waited outside. When it got dark, we climbed out the back window. We ran." Elias knew the description. Chester Arlo, a former Pinkerton man, a man who broke legs and burned barns for Harlan Dusk. Clara leaned forward. "Are you going to give us to him?" Elias looked at her. "He's going to come looking," Clara said. Her voice was steady, but her hands were gripping the edge of the table so hard her knuckles were white. "Papa told us to find you. He said you used to be the law, real law, not like that man. Are you going to send us back?" Elias looked at this 7-year-old girl. She had lost her father. She had almost frozen to death, and she was sitting here negotiating for her life. He leaned forward, resting his forearms on the table. "I promise you, Clara," Elias said. The words tasted heavy, like an oath. Until we find what's best, I won't send you anywhere I don't believe is safe. Nobody is taking you out of this house against your will. Not a man with a badge, not the governor himself." Clara searched his face. She was looking for a lie. She didn't find one. She let go of the table. "Okay," she said, just like that. "Okay." 3 days passed. The snow stopped falling, but the cold dug its heels in. The sky was a hard, brilliant blue, the kind that hurts your eyes. A routine had settled over the cabin. Agnes came by every morning. She cooked. She scolded Elias for having too much dust on his shelves. She taught Nora how to mend socks. Clara found an old, battered farmer's almanac and read it aloud to anyone who would listen. Elias spent his time in the barn. He taught the girls how to brush his old black horse, Drum. It wasn't because he wanted to play father. It was because they followed him out there, and he couldn't bring himself to send them back inside. He was stalling. He knew it. You can't hide 2 children in a valley where everybody knows everybody's business. The knock came on a Tuesday afternoon, except it wasn't a knock. It was the sound of a horse snorting at the front fence. Elias was in the kitchen, oiling a saddle strap. He stopped. The girls were in the back room with Agnes. Elias stood up. He walked to the window. A man was sitting on a brown gelding at the edge of Elias's property. Black leather coat, flat-brimmed hat pulled low. Chester Arlo. Elias didn't grab his rifle. He didn't want to show his hand. He stepped out the front door and stood on the porch. The cold wind whipped at his coat. He kept his hands in his pockets. Arlo didn't dismount. That was a tactic. It was meant to show that he wasn't staying long, and that he held the high ground. "I'm looking for 2 girls," Arlo called out. His voice was casual, like he was asking for directions to the general store. "Daughters of a man named Thomas Whitfield. Word in town is somebody saw 2 little shapes headed up this ridge a few nights back." Elias didn't move. "Word in town is usually mostly wind." Arlo smiled. It was a thin, ugly thing. Whitfield had an accident. Broke his neck out on the switchback. Terrible shame. Man had no family. Harlan Dusk has been appointed to manage the estate. I was hired to make sure those kids get collected and put in the county orphanage. Nice, warm beds for them down in Cheyenne. "Who hired you?" Elias asked. "The law," Arlo said, tapping his chest where a deputy's star was pinned to his leather coat. "Sheriff Briggs handed out those stars to whoever Dusk paid him to. I'm just doing my civic duty. Now, you seen them or not?" "There are no children out here for you to collect," Elias said. Arlo's smile faded. He shifted in his saddle. "You're a long way from anybody out here, Kane. Be a real tragedy if a man your age slipped on the ice, broke a hip, or worse." He leaned forward over the saddle horn. "I know who you used to be. You used to wear a star that meant something. So you know how this works. The law says those kids belong to the territory. You hide them, you're stealing from the court. You're a criminal." Elias took a slow breath. The icy air filled his lungs. He walked down the porch steps. He walked through the snow until he was standing right at the fence, looking up at Arlo. "The law you use," Elias said, his voice ringing loud and clear in the frozen air, "is written by men with guns and gold. It's a piece of paper you buy to justify your stealing." Arlo's eyes narrowed. His hand drifted closer to the iron on his hip. Elias didn't flinch. "But true justice is blind to a man's bank account. Those girls are human beings. Their human rights, their right to be treated with dignity, don't vanish just because their father died poor. You tell Harlan Dusk that he can buy the sheriff and he can buy the judge, but he can't buy what's right. And he sure as hell can't have what's in my house." Arlo stared at him. He was calculating the odds. Elias was unarmed, but he was standing too still. A man who isn't afraid to die is a dangerous man to draw on. Arlo tipped his hat. "I'll give your regards to Mr. Dusk. You better keep that fire burning, Kane. Winter's got a long way to go." He wheeled his horse around and rode off, kicking up white powder behind him. Elias watched him until he disappeared over the ridge. Then he went back inside. "Agnes," Elias called out, "I need you to stay the rest of the day. I have to go to town." The ride into Harlan Creek took over an hour. Drum hated the deep snow. Elias didn't push him hard. The town was a single street of clapboard buildings, saloon, general store, the brick facade of the First Territorial Bank, and Dr. Samuel Pratt's clinic. Elias tied Drum to the hitching post and went inside. The clinic smelled like iodine, strong soap, and old paper. Dr. Pratt was in the back, washing his hands in a tin basin. He was 50, graying, a good man who had spent too many years keeping his head down. "Elias," Pratt said, drying his hands on a towel. He looked surprised. "You haven't been in town since September." "I need to know about Thomas Whitfield," Elias said. He shut the door and locked it. Pratt looked at the lock. He sighed. He walked over to a heavy oak filing cabinet. He pulled out a thin manila folder and set it on the examination table. "I did the examination," Pratt said quietly. "Arlo brought the body in, said Whitfield fell off his wagon, broke his neck." "Did he?" Pratt shook his head. "The neck was broken, yes, but the bruising on the back of his legs and his ribs. He was beaten first, with something heavy. A rifle butt, maybe. And there was a bullet hole in his shoulder that someone tried to clean up. It wasn't an accident, Elias. It was an execution." Elias clenched his jaw. "Why didn't you go to the sheriff?" "Sheriff Briggs is in Dusk's pocket. You know that. I go to Briggs, I lose my practice. Or I end up with a broken neck on a switchback." Pratt leaned against the table. "Elias, why are you asking?" "Because I have his 2 girls at my place." Pratt closed his eyes. He rubbed the bridge of his nose. "Lord have mercy. Why did Dusk kill him, Sam?" Pratt walked over to the window. He looked out at the street, at the bank. "A surveyor came through here 2 months ago, Union Pacific. They're planning a new branch line. It's going to cut right through Harlan Valley, directly through the Whitfield property. They have a year-round spring. It's the most valuable piece of land in the county now." Elias saw the whole ugly picture. "If the girls are put in a territorial orphanage..." "They have no legal standing," Pratt finished. "Dusk holds a $200 mortgage on Whitfield's land. If Whitfield is dead, and the heirs are wards of the state, Dusk can foreclose the property. He sells it to the railroad. He makes $200,000. $200 owed, $200,000 to be made, and 2 little girls freezing in the snow to make the math work. He's going to come for them, Elias," Pratt said softly. "He has the law on his side. He'll get a judge to sign a guardianship order. You can't stop him." "I used to wear a star," Elias said. "And now you raise cows. Dusk will destroy you." Elias looked at his old friend. "If I give them up, they're dead. Even if they survive the orphanage, they've got nothing." He took the folder, handed it back to Pratt, and walked out. The ride home was colder. The sun was dipping below the mountains, painting the snow in shades of violet and bruised blue. Elias thought about leaving. He thought about packing up his horse, giving Agnes whatever money he had to take the girls to Cheyenne herself, and riding west. He had spent 4 years trying to stay out of the world, trying to avoid the pain of caring about anything. He rode up to his cabin. Smoke was curling from the stone chimney. He walked up the porch steps. He paused before opening the door. Through the thick wood, he could hear Clara's voice. She was reading the almanac. "April is the 4th month of the year. It brings the spring rains." And then Nora's voice, small and curious. "Is April when the green comes back?" "Yes," Agnes's voice said. "That's when the green comes back." Elias stood in the freezing dark. He thought of his wife, Maggie. He thought of his baby boy, James. He thought of the fire that took them, a fire he knew in his bones was lit by Dusk's men. He had run away then. He had let the corruption win because the grief was too heavy. He reached down. He turned the doorknob. He walked inside. The warmth of the cabin washed over him. Clara looked up from her book. Nora smiled. Agnes nodded from the stove. Elias didn't take off his coat. He walked straight past the table. He went to the heavy oak dresser in the corner. He opened the bottom drawer. He reached under a stack of folded shirts, his hand wrapped around cold, heavy iron. He pulled out the Colt .45 revolver, the gun he hadn't touched in 4 years. He pulled a box of brass cartridges from the drawer. Clara stopped reading. The room went dead silent. "Mr. Kane?" Clara asked. Elias broke the cylinder open. He slid a bullet into the chamber. Click. "Keep reading, Clara," Elias said. He slid another bullet in. Click. "We're staying right here." 10 days passed. The snow didn't stop. It just changed its mind on how hard it wanted to fall. Sometimes it was a light dusting. Sometimes it was a whiteout that blinded you if you stepped off the porch. The cabin settled into a rhythm, a strange, quiet kind of life. Elias didn't lock the gun away again. He kept the Colt on the high shelf near the door, fully loaded. He didn't point it out, but Clara saw it. Clara saw everything. She didn't ask about the gun. She asked about the barn. "Can we see the horse?" she asked one morning. The cold had finally broken just enough to let the sun shine through the frost on the windows. Elias put down his coffee. "He's just an old horse." "Papa had a mule," Nora said softly. "I like animals. They don't lie." Elias looked at her. 7 years old, and she already knew the nature of the world better than most men. He nodded. "Put your coats on." The barn was dim. It smelled of sweet hay, old leather, and manure. Drum, the 14-year-old black gelding, stood in his stall. He let out a low, rumbling snort when they walked in. He bumped his large head against Elias's shoulder. "This is Drum," Elias said. He picked up a stiff-bristled brush. Clara stepped right up to the wooden gate. She wasn't scared. Nora stood a few paces back, her hands swallowed up in the sleeves of her oversized coat. "You want to brush him?" Elias asked Clara. She nodded, serious, always serious. Elias showed her how. Long, sweeping strokes down the neck. Follow the grain of the hair. Don't go against it. Drum lowered his massive head, closing his eyes. He liked the girls. For the next week, that became the morning routine. Breakfast with Agnes. Then out to the barn. Elias would check the hooves. Clara would brush the coat. Nora would just stand there talking to the horse in a whisper so low Elias couldn't catch the words. It was peaceful. It was a dangerous kind of peace, the kind that makes you forget the wolves are circling just beyond the tree line. Then came December 24th, Christmas Eve. Nobody called it that, not out loud. But Agnes came over in the afternoon carrying an armful of fresh-cut pine branches. She laid them across the mantel above the stone hearth. The smell of sharp, clean pine filled the room. It smelled like memory. After supper, the wind picked up outside. It howled around the corners of the log cabin. The fire popped and cracked. Agnes had gone home before the snow got too deep. The girls were sitting on the rug. Elias sat on the floor near them. He didn't sit in his chair tonight. He sat on the rough-hewn floorboards, grounded. Clara was looking at the fire. "Do you ever get lonely on Christmas, Mr. Kane?" Elias stared at the orange flames. "For the last few years, I have. Yes." "What about before?" Elias didn't want to talk about it. The instinct was to shut down, to build the wall. But he looked at Clara and then at Nora. They had lost everything, and they were still here, still fighting. "Before," Elias said, his voice quiet. "I had a wife. Her name was Maggie, and a baby boy, James. He was only 6 weeks old." Nora looked up. Her big brown eyes locked onto his. "Where did they go?" "There was a fire," Elias said. The words tasted like ash. "While I was away working. They didn't make it out." The silence in the room was heavier than the snow on the roof. Clara pulled her knees to her chest. My papa always looked out the window when he thought about my mama. He looked scared. Nora says being scared and being careful look the same on the outside. Were you scared after they died? I was, Elias admitted. I was terrified. I thought everything I loved was cursed to burn. Nora shifted closer to him. She reached out. Her tiny, warm hand found Elias's large, calloused one. She didn't squeeze, she just rested it there. Mr. Kane, Nora whispered, how does a heart that froze to death come back to life? Elias looked at the little girl. He felt the warmth of her hand against his scarred palm. He thought about the anger that had been driving him for 4 years. And then he thought about the choice he made the night he brought them inside. He looked right at Nora, making sure she heard every word. It doesn't happen by forgetting, Nora, Elias said clearly. Listen to me. Healing doesn't mean pretending the scars aren't there. It doesn't mean the pain just vanishes. Healing is when you accept that you have to carry that scar, but you decide to use it to keep someone else warm. When you step out of your own grief to protect someone else's life, that compassion is what melts the ice inside your own soul. You can't heal by hiding. You heal by helping. Nora nodded slowly, like letting the lamp stay on. Exactly like that, Elias said. Clara leaned her head against her sister's shoulder. I think your heart is getting warmer, Mr. Kane. They fell asleep right there on the rug. Elias threw another blanket over them. He sat awake for a long time. The house smelled like pine. For the first time in 1,000 nights, Elias Kane felt like a human being. The feeling lasted until sunrise. Elias woke up at dawn. He walked out to the porch with a cup of black coffee. He looked out across the blinding white fields. Something was wrong. He set the cup down. He walked through the knee-deep snow toward the northern pasture, the barbed wire fence. 50 yards of it, cut clean through. The wire was coiled up and tossed into the snow. The wooden posts were hacked deep with an axe, and on the center post, driven in by a long iron nail, was a piece of parchment. Elias ripped it down. The handwriting was elegant, cursive, the kind of handwriting a banker learns. Last warning, the children belong to the court. Do not die for someone else's property. Elias crushed the paper in his fist. The wolves weren't just circling anymore. They were at the door. He couldn't wait anymore. Elias walked back to the house. He grabbed his heavy coat. He strapped his gun belt around his waist. The weight of the Colt on his hip felt familiar. It felt like the old days. Agnes had just arrived. She took one look at the gun belt and stopped in the doorway. I need to go to their property, Elias said. The Whitfield place. Dusk's men cut your fence, Agnes said. It wasn't a question. She had seen the tracks. They did, and they left a note. They're coming for the girls, Agnes. Through the law or through the dark. It doesn't matter. I need to know what Thomas Whitfield left behind. I need to know what they're so afraid of. I'll watch the girls, Agnes said. She walked past him to the stove. You keep your eyes open, Elias Kane. The snow covers a lot of sins. Elias saddled Drum. The ride west took over an hour. The land here was rugged. Pine trees gave way to rolling hills of white. When he reached the Whitfield homestead, he stopped on the ridge. He looked down at the property. It was a good piece of land. A small, sturdy log house, a modest barn. But the real treasure was cutting right through the center of the valley. A stream, but it wasn't frozen. Steam rose off the water in the bitter cold. An underground spring, year-round water. In Wyoming, that was worth more than gold. That was life. No wonder the railroad wanted it. No wonder Dusk was willing to kill for it. Elias rode down. He tied Drum to the porch rail. The front door of the house was locked. He didn't bother looking for a key. He kicked the door right below the knob. The wood splintered, the door swung open. The house was freezing, cold as a crypt. It had been ransacked. Chairs overturned, drawers pulled out and dumped on the floorboards, cushions slashed. Arlo and his men had been looking for something. Elias stood still. He breathed in the cold, stale air. He thought like a lawman. If I'm Thomas Whitfield, I know dusk is coming for me. I know I have proof. Where do I put it? Not in a drawer. Not under a mattress. Elias walked slowly through the main room. He went into the small back bedroom. The girls' room. 2 little cots. A handmade rag doll lying on the floor. Elias stepped over it carefully. He walked to the corner of the room near the small iron stove. Heat rises, moisture settles, wood warps. He knelt down. He pressed his hands against the floorboards. One of the planks shifted, just a fraction of an inch. Elias pulled his hunting knife from his boot. He wedged the thick blade into the seam of the wood and pried upward. The nail groaned, then popped loose. He pulled the board up. There, sitting in the dry dirt between the floor joists, was a small rusted tin box. Elias pulled it out. He blew the dust off the lid. He pried it open. Inside was a stack of papers wrapped in oilcloth. Elias stood up. He walked to the window to catch the pale winter light. He unfolded the cloth. The first paper was a receipt, stamped by the First Territorial Bank. It was dated December 1st, 1878, a week before Thomas Whitfield was killed. It showed a payment in full of $200, signed by a clerk named Harold Fitch. Thomas Whitfield had paid off his mortgage. He didn't owe Dusk a dime. Dusk had no legal right to foreclose on the property. Elias felt his heart hammer against his ribs. He turned to the next paper. It was a handwritten copy of a letter, addressed to the Territorial Land Office in Cheyenne. Thomas had written it out carefully. It detailed a conspiracy. Harlan Dusk was using insider information from the Union Pacific Railroad to force homesteaders off their land. Dusk was bribing the local judge and the sheriff to look the other way. Thomas was asking for a federal investigation. Whitfield hadn't just been a victim. He had been a whistleblower, a brave man standing alone against a corrupt machine. Elias went to put the papers back in the box. But there was one more thing at the bottom, a small, torn piece of ledger paper. Elias picked it up. He read the handwriting. 1874, East Valley fire. E. Kane refused to sell to Dusk. 3 weeks later, fire. Wife and child dead. Sheriff refused to investigate. Arlo seen in valley. Needs to be brought to light. Elias stopped breathing. The paper trembled in his hand. Thomas Whitfield had known. He had connected the dots. He was trying to find justice not just for himself, but for Elias, for Maggie, for little James. Thomas Whitfield was a man Elias had helped out of a minor jam 3 years ago. Elias had forgotten about it, but Thomas hadn't. Thomas had remembered. And when he was cornered, he told his daughters to find the man with the red barn. Because Thomas knew Elias was a good man, even when Elias didn't believe it himself. Elias folded the papers. He put them in his inside coat pocket, right over his heart. He rode Drum back to the cabin hard. The horse was lathered in sweat by the time they reached the porch. Elias burst through the door. Agnes looked up from the stove. Clara and Nora were at the table drawing on scrap paper. "Did you find something?" Agnes asked. Elias walked over to the table. He looked down at Clara, the 7-year-old girl who had hauled her sister through a blizzard. "Your father," Elias said, his voice thick with emotion, "was one of the bravest men I have ever known." Clara put her charcoal pencil down. "Why did he die, Mr. Kane? If he was brave, why did they hurt him?" Elias knelt beside the table. He looked her directly in the eyes. "Your father died protecting a truth, Clara," Elias said. He spoke slowly, making sure every word sank deep. He found out that Mr. Dusk was stealing land from poor folks to sell to the railroad, and your father proved that he had paid for his land in full. He didn't owe them anything, but Dusk killed him anyway. Do you know why?" Clara shook her head. "Because Dusk believes that having money makes him better than other people," Elias said. His voice was absolute iron. "But your father died standing up for the truth. that no matter how much money or power a man has, he has absolutely no right to trample on the sweat and blood of another human being. Your father believed in true equality. He believed that the dignity of a human life has to stand higher than a rich man's greed. He didn't just die for this farm. He died trying to protect the rights of every decent person in this valley. Clara stared at him. Her lower lip trembled just for a second. Then she firmed her jaw. Then they can't have our farm. It belongs to Papa. It belongs to you, Elias corrected. He patted his coat pocket. And I have the proof right here. Dusk is going to come to take you away. Because if you disappear, the truth disappears with you. What are we going to do? Nora asked quietly. Elias stood up. He looked at Agnes. He looked at his loaded gun on the shelf. We are going to tell the truth, Elias said. And we are going to make the whole damn town listen. The snow finally stopped on the 2nd of January. The sky cleared to a pale, brittle blue, the kind of clear that brings the deepest cold. Elias was at the chopping block. He wasn't splitting wood to tire himself out anymore. He was splitting it to keep the cabin warm, to keep the girls warm. It was a different kind of swing, deliberate, rooted. He heard them before he saw them, the heavy crunch of hooves breaking through the icy crust of the road. Elias sank the axe into the block. He left it there. He wiped his hands on his canvas trousers. He walked to the front of the cabin. 4 riders were coming up the ridge. Chester Arlo was in the lead, wearing that black leather coat. Next to him was Sheriff Walt Briggs. Briggs looked down at his saddle horn. He wouldn't look up. Behind them was Calvin Morse, a town lawyer who wore bowler hats and made a living finding loopholes for rich men. And right in the center, riding a beautiful roan stallion, was Harlan Dusk. Dusk didn't look like a frontier man. He wore a heavy wool overcoat with a fur collar, a purple velvet vest underneath, a gold watch chain looped across his stomach. He looked completely out of place against the raw timber in the snow. Elias stood on the porch. He didn't cross his arms. He let his hands hang loose by his sides. The riders pulled up to the fence. They stopped. The horses blew plumes of white steam into the air. Dusk dismounted. He moved with a smooth, practiced grace. He opened the wooden gate. He walked up the snowy path to the porch. He stopped at the bottom step. Mr. Kane, Dusk said. His voice was warm, cultured, like a man greeting an old friend at a social club. Cold morning to be standing outside. State your business, Dusk. Dusk smiled. He reached into his heavy overcoat. He pulled out a folded piece of thick legal paper. He handed it to the lawyer, Morse. Morse stepped forward. He cleared his throat. By order of the Territorial Court of Wyoming, signed by Judge Henry Korath on this day, December 28th, Harlan Dusk is hereby appointed as the temporary legal guardian of the minor children, Clara and Nora Whitfield. You are ordered to surrender the children immediately. Elias didn't look at the paper. He looked at Sheriff Briggs. You backing this, Walt? Briggs shifted in his saddle. He looked miserable. It's a lawful order, Elias, signed by the judge. I have to enforce it. You know what he's doing, Walt, Elias said. You know why he wants them. Dusk held up a gloved hand. He waved the lawyer back. He stepped up onto the first stair. He looked at Elias with eyes that were utterly dead. I am trying to provide for 2 unfortunate orphans, Mr. Kane, Dusk said smoothly. A single man, living in a shack. No wife, no family. This is no place for little girls. I have secured them places at a fine institution in Cheyenne. Warm beds. Education. You killed their father, Elias said. The words hung in the freezing air. Arlo stiffened. His hand dropped to his hip. Dusk didn't blink. He just offered a sad, patronizing sigh. Grief makes men say wild things. Thomas Whitfield died in a tragic accident. He left behind a debt. I am simply managing the fallout. Dusk leaned in closer. His voice dropped. Just for Elias. They're just worthless orphans, Kane. Nobody cares about them. Don't throw your life away for a piece of property that isn't yours. Elias felt the anger rise, cold and sharp. He stepped right up to the edge of the porch, looking down at the banker. "You listen to me, Dusk," Elias said. His voice carried across the yard, clear, ringing off the pine trees. "Equality isn't something you barter with. You think your money makes your life worth more than theirs. You think because they are young, and because they are poor, they have no value. You are wrong." Elias pointed a finger down at Dusk's chest. "The night I opened my door to keep them from freezing, I made a choice. And that choice is forever. You hear me? A human life is not a commodity you can foreclose on. They have the exact same right to safety, dignity, and freedom as you do. The law you bought from a corrupt judge might say otherwise, but true justice says they stay right here. You step over my dead body, or you ride back to town. There is no third option." Silence. Heavy and thick. Arlo drew his pistol halfway out of his holster. "I can end this right now, boss." Elias didn't look at Arlo. He kept his eyes locked on Dusk. "Try it on my porch, Arlo. See who hits the ground first." Dusk raised his hand again. He shook his head. He was a man of business. He didn't like messy shootouts in the daylight. 48 hours, Mr. Kane," Dusk said. The warmth was gone from his voice. It was pure ice. "The court order grants a 48-hour grace period for compliance. If you do not deliver the girls to my bank by 9 o'clock on the morning of January 4th, Sheriff Briggs will arrest you for kidnapping and obstructing justice. And Mr. Arlo will collect the children anyway." Dusk turned his back. He walked to his horse. He mounted up. 48 hours, Dusk repeated. He tipped his hat. "Enjoy the fire." They rode away, leaving the valley in silence. Elias stood on the porch until they were out of sight. His hands were shaking, not from fear. From the effort it took not to draw his gun and shoot Harlan Dusk in the back. He turned around. He walked into the cabin. Agnes was standing by the stove. She had a heavy iron skillet in her hand. She had been ready to use it. "They gave me 2 days, Elias said. "I heard," Agnes replied. She set the skillet down. "What are we going to do?" Elias looked at the closed door of the back bedroom. He walked over to it. He reached for the handle. The door opened before he touched it. Nora stood there. Clara was right behind her. They had heard everything. The walls of a log cabin don't keep out shouts. Nora walked up to Elias. She looked up at him. Her eyes were completely dry. She had thought about this. She had made a decision. "We can leave," Nora said. Her small voice was perfectly steady. "Me and Clara. We can pack our coats. We can walk away tonight before the sun comes up. They won't find us. And they won't hurt you." Elias felt his heart crack. A 7-year-old girl, offering to walk into a frozen wilderness to protect a grown man. Elias dropped to one knee. He took Nora by the shoulders, gently. "Nora," Elias said, "look at me." She met his eyes. "You don't ever have to run again," Elias told her. "I want you to understand something about family. Family isn't just about sharing blood. It isn't just about who your parents were. Family is about mercy. It's the decision to stand by someone when the world goes dark. It's the decision to never walk away. I am not walking away from you, and you are not walking away from me." Clara stepped forward. "But the law says he can take us. He has the paper." "He has a piece of paper," Elias agreed. He stood back up. "But I have the truth, and the truth is heavier." He turned to Agnes. "Keep the doors locked. Don't open them for anyone but me. I'm going into town." "To shoot him?" Agnes asked. "No," Elias said. He grabbed his coat. "You can't kill a corrupt system with a bullet. You just make room for the next rich man to step in. I'm going to town to wake the dead." The ride into Harlan Creek was brutal. The wind had picked up, driving icy needles into Elias's face. Drum fought every step of the way, but Elias kept him moving. It was past 9 o'clock at night when he reached the town. The street was empty. The saloon had a few lights on, but the rest of the buildings were dark and quiet. The whole town was hiding. Elias rode straight to the small white clapboard church at the end of the street. A single light was burning in the back window. Elias tied Drum to the post. He pushed the heavy wooden doors open. They creaked loudly. Reverend Aaron Cole was standing at the altar. He was 58, thin, balding. He was wiping down the communion rail with a cloth. He looked up as Elias walked down the center aisle. "Elias," Cole said. He looked tired. "I heard Dusk rode out to your place today." "He did," Elias said. He didn't stop until he reached the front pew. He reached into his heavy coat. He pulled out the oilcloth bundle. He set it on the polished wood of the altar. "What's this?" Cole asked. "Thomas Whitfield's ghost," Elias said. He opened the cloth. He laid out the receipt signed by Harold Fitch. He laid out the copy of the letter to the land office. Cole picked them up. He put his spectacles on. He read them in the dim candlelight. As he read, the color drained from his face. "Lord have mercy," Cole whispered. "He paid it. He paid the mortgage. Dusk murdered a man to steal his property." "Dusk is coming for the girls in less than 48 hours, Elias said. "He has a court order. Briggs is backing him. I can stand on my porch and shoot Arlo. I might even shoot Dusk. But then Briggs shoots me. And the girls go to Cheyenne. And the land goes to the railroad." Cole took his glasses off. He rubbed his eyes. "What are you asking me to do, Elias? I'm a preacher. I don't have a badge." "I don't need a badge. I need a voice," Elias said. "Dusk rules this town because everybody thinks they're standing alone. They think if they speak up, Arlo burns their house down. But Dusk can't burn the whole town down." Cole looked at the empty pews. Shadows stretched across the floor. "The people are afraid. Then you have to teach them not to be," Elias said firmly. "That's your job, isn't it? To teach people how to be good?" Cole stood there. A long silence stretched out. The wind rattled the stained glass windows. Finally, Cole straightened his back. The tired slouch left his shoulders. He picked up his Bible and set it firmly on the pulpit. "You're right, Elias," Cole said. His voice was gaining strength, finding its timbre. "I have preached about turning the other cheek for too long, when I should have been preaching about overturning the tables. Our silence in the face of evil is complicity. Every man in this town who looks the other way is helping Dusk load his gun. When a community turns its back on the right of 2 little girls to live in safety, that community surrenders its own human rights. Kindness and compassion aren't hobbies for when times are easy. They are the fundamental duty of being human. If we fail those children, we lose our souls." Elias nodded. "Are you with me?" "I am," Cole said. "Who is our first stop?" "The man who signed this receipt," Elias said, tapping the paper. "Harold Fitch." They walked out into the freezing night. Harold Fitch lived in a boarding house above the general store. He was 35, a nervous man who always looked like he was expecting a blow. Elias didn't knock. He pounded on the door. A minute later, the door cracked open. Fitch peered out holding a candle. He saw Elias and the Reverend. He tried to slam the door shut. Elias put his heavy boot in the doorway. He pushed it open. Fitch backed up, terrified. "I don't have anything to do with it. Dusk told me to stay out of it." Elias walked into the small room. He closed the door behind Cole. "You're already in it, Harold," Elias said. He pulled the receipt from his pocket and held it up to the candlelight. "You signed this, December 1st. You took Whitfield's money." Fitch stared at the paper like it was a rattlesnake. "Mr. Dusk told me to leave it off the official ledger. He said Whitfield was going to default anyway. He said if I logged it, I'd lose my job. I'd have nothing." "So you let a man die," Cole said softly. Fitch started to cry, quiet, hitching sobs. "I didn't know they were going to kill him. I swear to God I didn't know. I just thought they were going to squeeze him." Elias stepped closer. He didn't yell. He didn't threaten. "Harold," Elias said, keeping his voice steady, "I know you're scared. Dusk is a frightening man. But right now there are two little girls sitting in a cabin out on the ridge. They don't have a father anymore because of this piece of paper. And in 2 days, Dusk is going to take them away and erase them." Fitch wiped his eyes. "If I go against him, he'll ruin me." "He already ruined you, son," Cole said gently. "He made you a participant in murder. The only way to get your life back is to tell the truth." Elias looked Fitch right in the eye. "Human rights aren't granted by bankers, Harold. They belong to everyone. But they only survive if decent men stand up and protect them. I need you to stand at the church on the morning of January 4th, and I need you to tell the town what you did." Fitch looked at the floor. He trembled. Then he looked up at Elias. "I'll be there," Fitch whispered. "God help me, I'll be there." "He will," Cole said. They left Fitch in his room. The next stop was Dr. Pratt. They found Pratt awake in his clinic, drinking coffee and reading a medical journal. When Elias laid the papers on his desk, Pratt didn't hesitate. "This is federal," Pratt said immediately. He tapped the letter. "Dusk is manipulating land sales involving the Union Pacific Railroad. That's interstate commerce. That bypasses Judge Korath completely. If I ride to the telegraph office at the junction, I can wire the federal marshals in Cheyenne." "How long will it take them to get here?" Elias asked. 3 days, maybe 4 in this weather." "We don't have 3 days, we have 1. "Then you hold the line, Elias," Pratt said, grabbing his heavy coat. "You hold the line until the real law shows up. I'll ride out right now." Pratt left through the back door to saddle his horse. Elias walked out the front door of the clinic. The sky was beginning to turn a dark, bruised purple in the east. Morning was coming. 24 hours left. As Elias unhitched Drum, a shadow moved from the alleyway next to the bank. Sheriff Walt Briggs stepped out. He didn't have his hand on his gun. He held his hands up, palms out. "Elias," Briggs said. His voice was ragged, exhausted. Elias turned. He stared at the lawman. "You come to arrest me early, Walt?" Briggs shook his head. He looked down at the snow. "I haven't slept in a week, Elias. Ever since I saw those little girls out in the cold, I joined up to protect people, and I let Dusk put a collar around my neck because I owed him money." "You made your bed," Elias said coldly. Briggs looked up. There were tears frozen on his cheeks. "Is there a way out, Elias? Is there a way to make this right? I don't care if I go to jail, I can't look at myself in the mirror anymore. I can't let him take those children." Elias looked at the broken man in front of him. He saw a man who had forgotten what equality and justice actually meant. "There is a way, Walt," Elias said, "but you have to choose to be a man again. Tomorrow morning, 9 o'clock, at the church. Don't hide in your office." "What are you going to do?" Briggs asked. "I'm going to bring the truth into the light," Elias said. He climbed into the saddle. "Make sure you're standing on the right side of it." Elias spurred Drum. He rode out of town as the first sliver of sun broke over the mountains. The reckoning was coming, and Harlan Creek would never be the same. It was the morning of January 4th, 9 o'clock. The air was so cold it hurt to breathe. The sky was the color of bruised iron. It looked like it wanted to snow again, but the air was too frozen to let it fall. Elias hitched the wagon. He didn't saddle Drum today. He brought the wagon. He lifted Clara and Nora into the back, wrapping them in heavy wool blankets. Agnes sat up front next to him. She held a shotgun across her lap. She didn't say a word. She didn't have to. They rode into Harlan Creek. The main street was dead quiet. No horses at the saloon. No smoke from the blacksmith's chimney. The whole town looked abandoned. But it wasn't. When Elias pulled the wagon up to the small white church at the end of the road, he saw them. The church was built to hold maybe 40 people comfortably. This morning there were over 60. They were spilling out onto the front steps. The grocer, Mr. McCready, the school teacher, Miss Palmer, The Henderson family with their 3 boys, farmers, blacksmiths, stable hands, the people who had kept their heads down for 3 years. They were standing in the freezing cold, waiting. Reverend Aaron Cole stood at the top of the steps. He watched Elias pull the wagon up. He gave a single, slow nod. Elias stepped down. He helped Agnes down. Then he lifted the girls out. Clara stood straight. She brushed the wrinkles out of her borrowed dress. Nora stepped close to Elias and slipped her small hand into his large, rough palm. They walked up the steps. The crowd parted for them. Nobody spoke. You could only hear the crunch of snow under boots and the heavy, nervous breathing of 60 frightened people trying to find their courage. At exactly 9:30, the riders came. Harlan Dusk rode down the center of the street. Chester Arlo was on his right, Lawyer Morse on his left. 2 hired guns trailed behind. Dusk looked at the crowd gathered at the church. He didn't pull back on the reins. He didn't show surprise. Men like Dusk never show you they're bleeding until they're dead. He stopped his roan stallion right at the bottom of the church steps. "Morning, Reverend," Dusk said. His voice was smooth. "Looks like a full congregation today." Cole didn't flinch. "We're here to bear witness, Mr. Dusk." Dusk smiled. A cold, thin line. He looked past the preacher. He looked at Elias. And he looked at the 2 little girls. "Your 48 hours are up, Kane," Dusk said. He pulled out his pocket watch. Gold. Heavy. He snapped it shut. "I have the court order. I have the legal right. Hand the girls over, or we do this the hard way." Dusk didn't look back, but he called out, "Sheriff Briggs, step up and do your duty. Arrest this man for defying a territorial judge." The crowd held its breath. From the back of the crowd, near the church doors, a man stepped forward, Walt Briggs. He wasn't wearing his heavy coat, just his canvas shirt and his tin star. He walked down the wooden steps. He walked right past Elias. He stopped halfway between the church and the riders. "I'm not doing it, Mr. Dusk," Briggs said. His voice shook. But he didn't step back. Dusk's smile finally vanished. His eyes narrowed to dark slits. "Excuse me?" "I'm not doing it," Briggs repeated, louder this time. "I know I owe you money. I know you bought this badge, but I'm done. I'm not arresting a good man so you can steal from orphans." Dusk stared at him. The silence was thick enough to cut with a knife. "You're a fool, Walt," Dusk said softly. He nodded to Arlo. "Arrest him, too. Take the kids." Arlo swung down from his horse. He unhooked the leather strap over his pistol. He took 1 step toward the stairs. Elias moved. He didn't draw his gun. He just stepped in front of the girls. He stood at the top of the stairs, looking down at the ex-Pinkerton enforcer. "Take another step, Arlo," Elias said. The words were quiet, but they carried. "You're used to doing your killing in the dark. You're used to catching men alone on switchbacks. But you aren't in the dark today. You're standing in front of 60 witnesses." Arlo stopped. He looked at the crowd. He looked at the shotguns and rifles that were slowly, quietly being raised by the farmers and the shopkeepers. "This is a legal proceeding," Lawyer Morse stammered from his horse. "You are all interfering with the law." "It's not the law," Elias said. His voice rang out like a bell in the frozen air. "It's theft, and it's murder." Elias looked directly at Dusk. "You killed Thomas Whitfield," Elias stated. "He found out about your deal with the Union Pacific Railroad. He found out you were forcing homesteaders off their land so you could sell it for a fortune. He wrote a letter to the land office in Cheyenne. I have the copy." Dusk scoffed. A sharp, arrogant sound. "A letter proves nothing. The man defaulted on his mortgage. My bank foreclosed. It's simple business." "He didn't default," Elias said. He turned slightly. "Harold." Harold Fitch pushed his way through the crowd. He was shaking like a leaf in the wind. He clutched a piece of paper in his hands like it was a shield. He walked down the steps and stood next to Sheriff Briggs. "I'm Harold Fitch," he said. His voice cracked. He cleared his throat and tried again. "I'm the clerk at the First Territorial Bank. On December 1st, Thomas Whitfield paid his mortgage in full. $200. I took the money. I signed the receipt. Fitch held the paper up, high in the air. Mr. Dusk ordered me not to log it in the official books, Fitch yelled, the fear finally giving way to anger. He told me to hide it. He wanted the land. Dusk's face turned the color of ash. The crowd erupted. Angry shouts. A low, dangerous rumble of 60 people realizing they had been living under the boot of a thief and a murderer. Dusk raised his hands. These are lies, fabrications by a desperate man. He looked at the crowd, trying to find his authority. I am trying to protect these children. I am trying to give them a home. That was when Clara moved. Elias didn't stop her. He knew she had to do this. The 7-year-old girl walked past Elias. She walked down 2 steps. She stood above Harlan Dusk. She was so small. Her coat was too big. But she stood as straight as a pine tree. The crowd went completely silent. Clara looked at the banker. She didn't yell. She spoke with a terrifying, absolute clarity. We don't need your protection, Clara said. We need justice. You say we don't matter because we are children. You say we don't matter because we don't have money. But you are wrong. She turned and looked at the crowd, at the townspeople. My father taught me the truth, Clara said, her voice echoing off the wooden walls of the church. He taught me that under fair law, and in the eyes of God, my life is worth no less than the mayor's or the banker's or anyone else's. Human rights are not privileges that rich men hand out when they feel like it. They are absolute. My sister and I have the right to live safely. We have the right to keep what my father worked and died for. She turned back to Dusk. She pointed a small, shaking finger right at his chest. You let the coldness of greed freeze this town, Clara told him. You thought you could buy the law to strip away our humanity, but you can't buy the truth, and you can't buy the conscience of good people. She looked back at the town. I am asking you, all of you. My father was a good man. Are you going to let this man steal our rights? I am asking you to stand up and be human. For a second there was only the wind. Then Mr. McCready racked the lever of his Winchester rifle. The metallic clack-clack was deafening. I knew Thomas, McCready said loudly. He was an honest man, and these girls belong here. Miss Palmer stepped up. They stay. One by one, the voices joined in. A chorus, a wall of sound, 60 people finding their spine. 60 people standing between 2 orphans and the corrupt machine that wanted to crush them. Dusk looked around. He looked at the rifles. He looked at Sheriff Briggs, who had his hand resting on his gun butt. Dusk looked at Arlo. Arlo was a killer, but he wasn't a martyr. He slowly took his hand off his gun. He stepped back toward his horse. Not today, boss, Arlo muttered. You don't pay me enough to fight a whole town. Just then, the sound of galloping hooves cut through the noise. Dr. Samuel Pratt rode hard up the street. His horse was foaming at the mouth. Pratt pulled up next to the wagon. He held a yellow telegram in his hand. It's over, Dusk, Pratt shouted, breathless. I rode to the junction. I wired the federal marshals in Cheyenne. They intercepted the Union Pacific surveyor. They know about the fraud. The marshals are on a train right now. They'll be here in 2 days with federal warrants. Dusk sat on his horse. The elegant, cultured facade finally cracked. He looked small. He looked old. He didn't say another word. He turned his horse around. He rode away slowly, back toward his bank. A dead man walking. Arlo and the hired guns scattered, riding out of town in different directions. They wouldn't stick around for federal warrants. The standoff was over. Elias let out a breath he felt like he had been holding for 4 years. He turned around. Clara was standing on the steps, shivering now that the adrenaline was fading. Elias knelt down in the snow. He didn't care who was watching. He pulled the little girl into a tight embrace. Nora ran down the steps and threw her arms around his neck, too. Elias closed his eyes. He buried his face in their coats. You did it, Clara, Elias whispered. You did it. No, Clara said, her voice muffled against his shoulder. We did it. 3 weeks passed. The winter began to lose its teeth. The deep freezes gave way to milder afternoons. The snowbanks started to shrink, melting into the frozen earth. A lot happened in those 3 weeks. The federal marshals arrived on the morning train. They didn't knock politely at the bank. They kicked the doors open. Harlan Dusk was arrested sitting at his mahogany desk. They charged him with interstate land fraud, bribery, and conspiracy to commit murder. Chester Arlo didn't make it far. The marshals caught him trying to cross the border into Colorado. He was in a federal holding cell waiting for a rope. Sheriff Walt Briggs resigned his badge. He packed his bags and moved out west. He didn't go to jail. Dr. Pratt and Reverend Cole wrote letters to the federal judge explaining how Briggs had stood down and helped prevent a slaughter. But Briggs couldn't look the town in the eye anymore. He had to go find his own redemption somewhere else. As for the town, it woke up. It woke. People started talking to each other again. They painted their storefronts. They fixed their fences. When the shadow of fear was lifted, Harlan Creek remembered how to be a community. It was a Tuesday afternoon. Elias was sitting on the porch of his cabin. The sun was actually warm on his face. Clara and Nora were sitting on the steps below him. A man in a suit, a federal lawyer from Cheyenne, was standing in the yard, packing documents into a leather briefcase. "It's done, Mr. Kane," the lawyer said, snapping the case shut. "The territorial court order Dusk fabricated has been officially voided. The deed to the 320 acres is legally bound to Clara and Nora Whitfield. It is held in trust until they are of age. Nobody can ever take that land from them." The lawyer tipped his hat to the girls. "You take care of yourselves." He climbed into his buggy and rode off down the ridge. Clara watched the buggy disappear. She held a copy of the deed in her lap. Heavy parchment. Official stamps. She traced the wax seal with her finger. "It really belongs to us." "It always belonged to you," Elias said. "Now the paper just matches the truth." Clara looked up at him, those dark, serious eyes. "Mr. Kane, what you said to Mr. Dusk on the porch, about human rights, about everyone being equal. I meant every word." "The lawyer said the law worked today," Clara said thoughtfully. "But it didn't work before. It only worked because you stood up. And because Mr. Fitch stood up." Elias leaned forward, resting his forearms on his knees. This was important. This was the lesson she needed to carry for the rest of her life. "The law is just a tool, Clara," Elias explained softly. "Like an axe or a hammer. In the hands of a corrupt man like Dusk, it's a weapon used to oppress people. But true justice isn't a piece of paper. The law worked today exactly how it was meant to, blind to wealth and illuminated by the truth. But you taught this entire valley a hard lesson. You taught them that human rights aren't handed down from above by kings or judges. They are something we have to stand side by side to protect. If good people don't speak the truth out loud, the law is just empty words." Clara nodded slowly. She understood. Nora leaned against Elias's knee. "Are we going to live in our old house now?" Elias looked at the deed. Then he looked at the girls. "That's your choice. Your land is right next to mine. I was thinking, maybe we tear down a section of the fence, build a wide gate. You can live in your house, but the gate stays open. You come here when you want. I go there when I need to. We don't have to live in the same room to be a family." Nora smiled, a real bright smile. "Family is the decision to stay. That's what you said." "I did," Elias said, "and I'm staying." Later that afternoon, the girls went down to the barn to brush drum. Elias stayed in the cabin. The house was quiet. But it wasn't the dead, crushing silence of the last 4 years. It was a comfortable quiet, the kind that leaves room for breathing. Elias walked down the short hallway. He stopped at the door at the very end, the door with the heavy wooden plank nailed across it. He stood there for a long time. He listened to the faint sound of the girls laughing out in the barn. Elias went to the kitchen. He grabbed the claw hammer. He walked back to the door. He wedged the claws under the iron nails. He pulled. The wood groaned, protesting. He pulled harder. The nail popped out. He moved to the other side. He ripped the plank off the frame and let it clatter to the floor. He put his hand on the brass knob. He turned it. He pushed the door open. The air inside was stale. Dust motes danced in the shafts of sunlight cutting through the cracks in the shutters. It was a nursery. A small wooden crib sat in the corner. A rocking chair by the window. On a small dresser there was a tin box. Elias walked into the room. His boots sounded loud on the bare floorboards. He walked over to the dresser. He opened the tin box. Inside was a faded tintype photograph of a beautiful woman with a gentle smile. Maggie. Beside the photo was a tiny knitted blue shirt. James. Elias picked up the photograph. He traced Maggie's face with his thumb. He didn't cry. He didn't break down. The crushing, suffocating weight in his chest, the ice that had been freezing his lungs for 4 years, was gone. He looked at the picture and he spoke, out loud, his voice steady and clear in the empty room. "I found a reason, Maggie," Elias said softly. "Not the reason I wanted. Not the life we planned, but I found them and they needed me. And they—" He picked up the tiny blue shirt. He held it gently. "I understand it now," Elias said to the empty room. He was speaking to the ghosts, but he was also speaking to himself. "I spent 4 years thinking that if I stopped hurting, it meant I stopped loving you. I thought the pain was the only way to keep you alive, but Nora asked me how a frozen heart comes back to life." Elias walked over to the window. He pushed the heavy wooden shutters open. Bright, blinding, beautiful sunlight flooded the nursery. It washed over the crib. It warmed the floorboards. Elias set the photograph and the little blue shirt on the windowsill, right in the center of the warm light. "Healing is when you accept you have to carry that scar," Elias whispered, staring out the window toward the open pastures. "But you decide to use it to keep others warm. I'm going to keep them warm, Maggie, I promise you." He turned around. He walked out of the room. He didn't close the door behind him. He left it wide open, letting the light from the nursery spill out into the hallway, letting the warmth fill the house. He walked out to the front porch just as Clara and Nora were coming back from the barn. "Mr. Kane," Nora called out, running up the steps. "Drum likes the spring weather. He's not sad today." Elias looked at the little girl. He looked at the melting snow. He looked at the gate he was going to build tomorrow. "No," Elias said, a genuine, easy smile breaking across his weathered face. "He's not sad today at all." A year went by. It was the spring of 1880. The winter that year didn't fight as hard. It gave way to April with a quiet, muddy surrender. The valley turned green. A vibrant, shocking green that made your eyes ache if you stared at it too long. The creek on the Whitfield land was running high and clear, cutting through the thawing earth. Things were different now. You could see it just by looking at the property line. The barbed wire fence that used to separate Elias Kane's ranch from the Whitfield land was gone. At least, a 50-foot section of it was. In its place, Elias had built a wide, heavy wooden gate. He didn't put a latch on it. He didn't even put hinges on it that swung shut. He propped it open with a heavy granite stone. It stayed open from sunrise to sundown, and usually through the night, too. The old black gelding Drum wasn't alone in the barn anymore. Elias had bought a 3-year-old roan mare named Penny. Clara had told him Drum looked lonely. Elias knew horses didn't get lonely like people did, but he bought the mare anyway, because Clara asked. That was the new rule of the house. You listened, you paid attention. Agnes Holloway didn't just come over when there was an emergency anymore. She came over every morning. She baked biscuits, she fried bacon. She scolded Elias for tracking mud onto her clean floorboards. It was the first time in her life she let herself be a grandmother. Elias was drinking his coffee differently. For 40 years he drank it black, bitter, strong enough to strip paint. But one morning, Clara had watched him wince at the bottom of the cup. She asked him why he drank something that tasted like punishment. Elias didn't have an answer. So he started putting sugar in it, 2 spoonfuls. It was a small thing, but it meant he was done punishing himself. It was a Tuesday morning when the letter arrived from Cheyenne. Elias rode into Harlan Creek to pick it up at the post office. The town was alive. People waved at him. Mr. McCready was sweeping the boardwalk in front of his store. He tipped his hat. Dr. Pratt was sitting on a bench smoking a pipe. Elias walked into the telegraph and post office. He took the heavy manila envelope. He walked out to the boardwalk and broke the wax seal. They were guardianship papers, official, stamped by the new federal judge. It didn't make him their father. Elias knew he could never replace Thomas Whitfield. He didn't want to, but the papers made him their protector. Under the law, and in the eyes of the world, those girls were his responsibility. Elias needed signatures to make it final. Character witnesses. He didn't have to look hard. Dr. Pratt signed it first, right there on the bench. He didn't even read the fine print. Reverend Cole came out of the church, his hands covered in garden dirt. He wiped them on his trousers and signed his name in looping, elegant script. Mr. McCready signed it. Elias rode back to the ranch. He walked into the kitchen. Agnes was at the stove. Clara and Nora were at the wooden table. They were 8 years old now. Taller, their cheeks were full and pink. The hollow, haunted look of the freezing winter was entirely gone. Elias laid the papers on the table right next to Clara's arithmetic book. "What is that?" Clara asked. She didn't put her pencil down. "Guardianship papers," Elias said. He pulled out a chair and sat backward on it, resting his arms over the wooden back. "The federal court approved it. It means nobody can ever come and take you away. It means this is your home, permanently, if you want it." Clara looked at the papers. She read the thick legal print at the top. Then she just nodded. She picked her pencil back up. She started working on a long division problem. Elias frowned. He looked at Agnes. Agnes just smirked and flipped a pancake. "You don't have anything to say?" Elias asked. Clara didn't look up. "I already knew." "Knew what?" "I knew you were going to stay. I knew we were safe." Clara finished writing a number, then she set the pencil down. She looked across the table at Elias. Those dark, serious eyes locked onto his. "You want to know when I knew, Mr. Kane?" Clara asked. "When?" "The first night," Clara said. "When you brought us in from the snow. Nora was scared of the dark, but she didn't ask you to leave the lamp on. I asked you." "I remember." "A man who's going to send 2 orphans away to die doesn't leave the light on," Clara said. Her voice was steady. It held the weight of a preacher giving a sermon. "A man who thinks our lives have no value wouldn't care if we were scared of the dark. But you cared. You left the light on." Clara leaned forward. She tapped her small finger on the legal papers. "You taught us something, Mr. Kane. And Papa taught us too," Clara said. She was speaking the truth into the room, making sure every corner heard it. "Human worth isn't something you earn. It's not something you buy. It is a right, the right to be safe, the right to be warm, the right to be treated with dignity. You didn't leave the light on because we were rich or because we were important. You left it on because we were human beings, and a good man protects human life, no matter what." Elias sat there. He listened to this 8-year-old girl articulate the exact moral truth that had saved his soul. He reached across the table. He pulled the papers closer. He picked up a pen, dipped it in the inkwell, and signed his name at the bottom. "You're right, Clara," Elias said quietly. "Every word." Nora reached over and touched the wet ink of his signature. She didn't smudge it. She just hovered her finger over it. "Family is the decision to stay," Nora whispered. "That's what this paper means." That evening, the sun took a long time to set. Spring evenings in Wyoming linger. The sky turns a pale, brilliant orange streaked with bruised purple clouds. The wind dies down and the whole valley smells like wet earth and new pine needles. Elias was sitting on the front steps of the porch. He had a cup of coffee in his hands, 2 spoonfuls of sugar. He was watching the horses graze near the open gate. The screen door squeaked open behind him. Nora walked out. She had her own small tin cup. It was mostly warm milk with a splash of coffee, and about 3 spoons of sugar. She sat down right next to Elias. She didn't ask. She just folded her legs and bumped her shoulder against his arm. They sat in silence for a long time, watching the light fade. "Are you happy, Mr. Kane?" Nora asked suddenly. Elias didn't answer right away. He thought about it. Truly thought about it. He thought about the locked room inside the house, the nursery. He went in there sometimes. He looked at Maggie's picture. He looked at the little blue shirt. It still hurt. It would always hurt. But it wasn't a crushing, breathless pain anymore. It was just an ache, like an old broken bone that reminds you it rained. He looked at Nora. "I am," Elias said. "I really am. But it took me a long time to learn how." Nora blew on her warm milk. "Papa used to tell me about happiness before he died. I remember we were sitting on the wagon. He told me that happiness isn't a place you go to find." "No?" Elias asked. "No," Nora said firmly. "Papa said happiness is something you build, and you build it by treating people right. He told me that when you look at another person, even if they are poor, even if they are broken, even if they are a stranger, and you treat them like their life is sacred, that's when you find peace." She looked up at the fading orange sky. "He said that protecting the vulnerable is the only way to protect your own heart," Nora added. "Because if you let other people freeze in the cold, your own heart freezes too. You kept us warm, Mr. Kane, so your heart got warm. That's why you are happy." Elias stared at the little girl. The profound, simple wisdom of it hit him like a physical force. He put his arm around her shoulders and pulled her close. "Your papa was a very wise man, Nora." "I know," Nora said. She rested her head against his heavy canvas coat. "And so are you. You just forgot for a little while." Elias smiled, a deep, true smile. "Yeah, I forgot for a little while, but I remember now." Elias Kane lived in Harlan Valley for another 30 years. He didn't die in a gunfight. He didn't die chasing outlaws. He lived to be an old man with snow-white hair and hands that shook when he poured his coffee. He died quietly, in his sleep, in the house he had built, with the 2 women he had raised sitting right by his bedside. He was never a legend the way the dime novels write about lawmen. He didn't have songs sung about him in the saloons of Cheyenne. But he was a different kind of hero, the real kind, the kind that stands in the gap between the wolves and the sheep, the kind that leaves the light on. Clara Whitfield grew up. She took that fierce, unbending belief in fairness and turned it into a weapon. In 1890, when Wyoming became a state, Clara was one of the first women to pass the bar exam. She became a lawyer. She didn't work for the railroads, she didn't work for the banks. She worked for the homesteaders. She stood in front of federal judges, men in heavy black robes who thought women had no place in a courtroom, and she argued for equal rights. She was the first lawyer in the state to successfully argue that a woman had the absolute, undeniable right to hold a property deed in her own name, regardless of a husband or a father. When a reporter from an Eastern newspaper asked her why she fought so hard for the vulnerable, Clara didn't hesitate. "Because a man's worth is not defined by his wealth, and a woman's right is not defined by her gender," Clara told the reporter. "Human rights are absolute. I almost froze to death when I was 7 years old because a rich man thought my life had no price tag. A good man taught me that life doesn't need a price tag to be sacred. I fight so that no child in this state ever has to freeze in the dark again." Nora Whitfield took a different path. She didn't use words, she used colors. She became a painter. She traveled to Chicago, to New York. She studied under masters. But she never painted European landscapes or high society portraits. She painted the West, the real West. She painted the mud, the snow, the tired faces of farmers. She painted the brutal, beautiful reality of the frontier. Her art was a testament to the dignity of ordinary people. Her paintings hung in 3 galleries in Chicago and 1 in Manhattan. But her most famous painting, the one that hung in the state capitol building in Cheyenne, wasn't a landscape at all. It was a portrait. It was a painting of a man. He had silver in his hair and broad, stooped shoulders. He was sitting on a wooden porch step. He held a tin cup of coffee in his scarred hands. He wasn't looking at the viewer. He was looking out across a green valley toward a wide wooden gate that was propped open with a stone. The painting captured something profound. It captured the quiet, immense power of a man at peace. Nora titled the painting, "The Man Who Left the Light On." Years later, when Nora was an old woman herself, a young art student came to interview her. The student asked her to explain the painting. They asked her what the deeper meaning was behind the old cowboy on the porch. Nora smiled. She looked at her own wrinkled hands, hands that still held a brush every morning. And she gave an answer that summed up the entire history of Harlan Valley. An answer that defined Elias Kane and the long, bitter winter of 1878. Some men, Nora said, her voice soft but unwavering, spend their whole lives wandering the earth looking for the place they belong. They think if they ride far enough they will find peace. The man in that painting tried to leave his life behind before he found it. She looked up at the young student. In the freezing winter of 1878, that man didn't just save two twin girls starving in the cold. He saved his own soul. It wasn't the land that kept him there, and it wasn't the law. Nora pointed a finger toward the window, toward the open sky. It was the absolute, unshakable belief that every human life holds equal, undeniable value, Nora said. It was the knowledge that compassion is the only thing that cures grief. He made one choice that night to open his door. He made one choice to let the light shine out into the dark. It was the simple, terrifying, magnificent choice to stay. One choice. Forever. The characters, settings, and events portrayed in this story are entirely fictional. While certain themes may echo real-life experiences, they are shaped by creative interpretation. The author does not intend to represent or depict any specific individual, organization, or historical event.
As the snow finally gave way to spring in Harlan Valley, what remained was not just a quiet piece of land saved from greed, but a truth carved deep into the hearts of everyone who had witnessed it. This story is not merely about a former lawman, two orphaned girls, or a corrupt banker brought to justice. It is about the moment a broken man chose to stand again, and in doing so, reminded an entire town of what it means to be human. Elias Kane did not win because he was the fastest with a gun, or the strongest man in the valley. He won because he chose compassion over indifference, courage over fear, and truth over silence. In a world where laws were twisted to serve the powerful, he understood something far more important, that justice does not begin in courtrooms, but in the hearts of those willing to defend what is right. And sometimes, the bravest thing a person can do is simply refuse to look away. Clara and Nora, though small and fragile in the eyes of the world, carried a strength that many grown men had long forgotten. They reminded us that dignity is not something granted by wealth or status. It is something inherent, something unshakable. Their quiet resilience, their belief that their lives mattered, even when the world told them otherwise, became the spark that lit a fire in an entire community. And that is perhaps the most powerful truth this story offers. Even the smallest voices can awaken something greater when they refuse to be silenced. The people of Harlan Creek learned a hard lesson, that evil does not thrive because it is strong, but because good people stay silent for too long. Fear can isolate us, convince us that we stand alone. But the moment one person steps forward, speaks the truth, and refuses to yield, others begin to follow. And suddenly, what once seemed like an unstoppable force begins to crumble. Justice, in the end, is not a gift handed down by those in power. It is something built, protected, and carried forward by ordinary people who choose to stand together. And perhaps the most personal lesson lies within Elias himself. For years, he believed that his pain was all he had left of the family he lost, that letting go of that pain meant letting go of love. But through these children, he came to understand that healing is not about forgetting. It is about transformation. It is about taking the scars we carry and using them to protect others, to create warmth where once there was only cold. In choosing to care again, Elias did not betray his past. He honored it. So what does this story leave us with? It reminds us that every human life holds equal worth, no matter how small, how poor, or how forgotten it may seem. It challenges us to ask ourselves, when faced with injustice, will we turn away, or will we stand? Because in the end, the measure of a person is not found in what they possess, but in what they are willing to protect. And maybe, just maybe, it reminds us that even in the harshest winters of our lives, something good can still grow, if we have the courage to keep the fire burning.